allegedly in Europe, they take a more precautionary principle approach. It's one of the reasons why, there's only about 300 to 400 food additives that are approved by the EU for use there. Whereas here we take a more risk management approach. There are thousands of chemicals, and we put basically the onus of, the burden of proof that these additives are safe on the food manufacturers.
So the EFSA and the FDA basically look at the same studies when they're coming up with approval versus not approval, or like sometimes you'll have a different acceptable daily intake level set in Europe versus Canada versus the USA. They're generally looking at the same research, right? They're generally looking at the same numbers. And they do, so like risk tolerance is a little bit different in Europe versus here. But there's also, chemicals that are allowed in Europe that are not allowed here. For example, they allow like 16 different food colorings, artificial food dyes, and we allow 9, I think, right? So there's a bunch that so it kind of goes both ways is what I'm trying to say. And I think, part of that is sort of, there's sort of an approach to like, how are we going to set our acceptable daily intake level? Are we going to apply a safety factor of 100 or a safety factor of 1,000? Are we going to use the lowest observed adverse effect level as our limit, or the no observed adverse effect level as our limit? And that feels to me like I want to let experts decide what is the best way to approach it. But one of the big differences between Europe and America is the power of the regulatory agencies able to monitor what companies are doing. And that is not something that we have here to the same level. So we kind of have this like more unrestrained free market with food manufacture.
Here?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that has decreased the quality of our food for sure, right? Like I think that has led to a very profit motivated approach where we're going to engineer food to be as hyper palatable as possible to get the biggest possible market share, and not necessarily create food that is nutrient dense, right? And I think a lot of that could be solved again by better funding regulatory agencies. Like I will let someone else tell me if the better approach for setting an acceptable daily intake level is the European method versus the American method. I'm comfortable with either because they both have these safety factors applied. And I think that's just like a philosophical difference where probably nobody's wrong and maybe nobody's right. But like, I think I can buy the argument each way. But I think that the bigger challenge here is we've got a system where whole fresh foods cost approximately double what their ultra processed counterparts are. And ultra-processed foods are available everywhere, right? You live in the middle of nowhere. You live an hour from the closest grocery store. You can get your ultra-processed foods at your local Dollar General, your Dollar Tree, your gas station. There's going to be foods there that you can get, and the whole foods cost twice as much and are much harder to get. We've got systemic issues to accessibility and affordability that need to be solved. Like, and that is way bigger than you or I can solve. But I think that is sort of like a prerequisite for helping people eat a more nutritious diet. We need to be able to get the foods into their homes affordably. And right now, we've got a system where those are right. They don't require refrigeration. There's lots of actual reasons behind why they're the most accessible, right? They don't require refrigeration. They can store nearly indefinitely. But I think it's not just about the additives, it's about the nutrients that are remaining, and it's about accessibility and affordability. Like, all of those things have to come together.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I did an experiment where I went to a local 99-cent store a 2 years ago, and I looked to see like what I could buy, on a budget, whole food wise, and it was pretty slim pickings. But I found canned fish, I found canned legumes and things like that.
What's fascinating to me is that potentially a lot of those are actually technically ultra-processed foods.
Would you say they're ultra-processed or just processed?
So,
because there is a difference.
Yeah, absolutely there's a difference. And I think we need even a more nuanced, better way to tell the difference. So when we hear statistics like 58% of the calories in America come from ultra-processed foods, that is using the NOVA classification. So NOVA divides all foods into 4 groups. Whole and minimally processed, so that'll be your salmon fillet, your head of broccoli, right? Processed culinary ingredients, that is your sugar, your oils, your things that you're going to add, whether at home or in the factory. Then your processed foods, so that would include things like whole wheat bread. That would include cheese, it counts as a processed food. A lot of like frozen vegetables, canned vegetables would count as a processed food. And then ultra processed, which includes some actually really nutrient dense foods. So it would include like canned soup, frozen dinners, fruit on the bottom yogurt, instant oatmeal, the egg whites that you buy in the carton, right? Protein bars, protein powder.
Egg whites are a food, like they're an extract of eggs. They're not.
So the NOVA classification looks at the level of processing of the ingredients and the amount of additives. And so, for example, some cans of like canned black beans would count as NOVA class 3, and then depending on the additives, some would count as NOVA class 4. So there was this really fascinating study done last year, 2023, where they were like, yo, we've got a problem in defining ultra processed foods here. We need to address this, because if we just go ultra processed foods bad, right? We might be lumping in a lot of nutritious, healthy foods into this category. And a study that looks at like the health benefits of legumes isn't going, well, which canned beans did you get, right?
Yeah.
It's just looking at, did you eat the legumes? Yes or no. So some of those might have been ultra processed, right? Canned beans. So what the study did was they had 2 panels of independent experts. One group of experts on the NOVA classification. They said, here's a bunch of foods. You tell me what NOVA class this is. And they got their list of 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s. And they had this other group of experts. You're a bunch of dietitians. You tell me if this food satisfies the recommendations of the USDA dietary guidelines for Americans, right? Does this food count as a dairy serving, or as a vegetable serving, or as a protein serving? And then they looked at those 2 lists, and they had about 200 foods that were on both lists. So both in ultra processed foods, right, those canned beans with just happened to have some extra additive that pushed it into NOVA class 4, and the dietitians were like, yeah, no, that totally counts as a legume for USDA dietary guidelines for American purposes. Then they crafted a 7-day meal plan using these foods. It was 2,000 calories per day. And it's like breakfast burrito with a flour tortilla, scrambled egg whites from the carton with margarine, cans of black beans of the NOVA class 4 version of black beans, and some like pre-grated cheese from the bag, which would count as ultra processed instead of processed. And then we'll add a glass of orange juice and some ultra filtered milk, right? Like, I think most people would look at that meal, and sure, we might have a conversation of like things we could add to it to make it even better, but you look at that meal and go, yeah, it's solid, like, sure. So the meal's kind of like that, right? So 91% of the calories from this meal plan came from technically ultra processed foods, and yet it scored an 89 on the healthy eating index. The things that stopped it from scoring better was it overdid sodium. Canned foods tend to do that. There's ways that you could mitigate that. You could choose the low sodium options. You could rinse foods like beans to get rid of like 3/4 of the sodium by doing that. And it was insufficient in whole grains compared to what the dietary guidelines for Americans are. The average American score is 59. So we've got this whole collection of foods that are accessible, that are in your 99-cent store, that you could craft a healthy diet with. They are more affordable, and we need some kind of way of like, what like, we don't know, out of these 58% of calories that Americans are consuming that are coming from ultra processed foods, we don't know how many of them are those foods versus, fast food and
sugar sweetened beverages,
right, and donuts and Doritos, right? Like, we don't actually have that data. We need a better way to differentiate within ultra processed foods which ones are like making us overdo sugar and saturated fat and salt, and are contributing so few nutrients that they're causing more nutrient insufficiencies, and which ones are really great healthy options. And that's where I think Nutrivore can really fit in, because we can look at those foods and quantify the nutrient density. We can come in and say, oh, look at all of the nutrients per calorie that these foods have versus these foods. And we can add this really important data point to not just the level of processing. That's important. Like, we want to know that. But also, sometimes the processing strips out all the valuable nutrients, right? And sometimes it doesn't. And so being able to differentiate between this group that we want to moderate, not restrict, because we're moving beyond this like good or bad food, but we definitely don't want this to be the majority of our diet, versus these ones that, yeah, look, we can craft this nutrient-dense diet. They analyzed the micronutrients for, was within the accepted macronutrient distribution ranges for protein, carbs, and fat. It went over the recommended dietary allowance for fiber. It about doubled the dietary allowance for protein, which is way too low, so double's about perfect. And then it safely exceeded, so in that like 1 to 300% of daily value range, every essential vitamin and mineral, except it fell slightly short on vitamin E, vitamin D, and choline. But the dietary guidelines for Americans already fall short on those. So that was probably not a fault of the food, right? It's probably the fault of the dietary structure needing, I think the dietary guidelines for Americans still need a little extra work, right?
Yeah. Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.